So let's take a look at relative and absolute references a little bit closer. On this worksheet, I've just put some text values in cells A1 through C3 to demonstrate how relative and absolute cell references work. If I reference the value in cell A1 here, in cell A5, I would expect that value to return A1, since that's the content of cell A1. Copying and pasting that value down, I would expect, since I'm using a relative reference, the value in A6 to be A2, and the value in A7 to be A3. Likewise, if I copy and paste this over, I would expect the values in column B to reference the values in column B in the table above and read B1 through B3 respectively, and the values in column C to reference the values in column C in the table above. So as you can see, a relative reference updates both the row and column depending on how you copy and paste that reference. So referencing cell A1 in cell A5 here means that if I copy and paste that down, my reference will automatically update the row. Likewise, if I copy and paste it over to reuse that reference, notice that the row number doesn't change, but the column letter does according to the fact that I'm copying and pasting from column to column. That's a relative reference. A relative reference is the default reference type in Excel. So just referencing a cell will give me a relative reference. An absolute reference, on the other hand, will allow me to hold either the column or the row part of a reference, or both, constant when I copy and paste. So to create a constant reference on the column side, I put a $ in front of my column portion of my reference. And again, the column portion of the reference is the letter portion of the reference. So by putting a $ in front of the A here, copying and pasting this reference down will do nothing to the relative part of the row reference. Notice that I'm still incrementing my row as I copy and paste down. But if I copy and paste that reference over, notice that the column portion of that reference remains constant and always points to column A, regardless of where I paste that in subsequent columns of my workbook. So for example, the reference now in cell B5 points in an absolute fashion to cell A1 because I've held the reference to column A constant. I can do the same thing to a row reference. So in this case, by making the row reference constant, I would expect for cells A6 and 7, when I reuse this reference, to all point to cell A1. But by leaving the column reference relative, I would expect the cells in column B and column C to point to cells or columns B and C of the table above. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to copy and paste. Notice that when I copy and paste down, my reference stays constant to row 1 of the table because I've made that an absolute reference. But when I copy and paste over, my column reference, or the letter in the reference, automatically increments because I allowed that to be a relative reference. Now, as you might expect, if I make both the column and the row reference absolute, when I copy and paste this over, I would expect my reference to remain constant on cell A1 because I've made that reference absolute on both the column and the row. Getting absolute and relative references correct can be really important to getting the right calculations in our spreadsheet. So if we go back to the student scores worksheet here and think about what it is that we want this exam calculation to do, we can construct the correct set of relative and absolute references. So to calculate the exam with bonus correctly, we want a relative reference for each of the student's exam scores, so that when we copy and paste that down, we automatically increment the row number of our reference. But we want an absolute reference to the row part of the exam bonus for each student, because we don't want the reference to cell C1 to automatically increment the row as we copy and paste it down. So let's go ahead and fix this function. Again, we want a relative reference to the exam score, so we want C3 to be a relative reference, and we want an absolute reference on the row for the exam bonus. So we don't want the one part of the C1 reference to automatically increment as we copy and paste down. When I hit enter and copy and paste, notice that my calculation is correct, and if I take a look at my reference here, I do have a relative reference on the exam score for students, but I have an absolute reference pointing to the exam bonus that will be applied to all students.